All right, everyone, one last topic, one last chapter, one last push in this training. And if you manage to get up to this point, then this is probably going to be a piece of cake for you. And it actually is. Physical security is not exactly the simplest topic out there, but it's a lot of common sense in it. Because we can all understand why physical security is of paramount importance. It doesn't matter if it's about your home, your car, your data center, even the place that actually stores your data. There are a lot of situations in which physical equipment can be hijacked, can be compromised simply by being in the vicinity of it, by having access to the actual disks, the actual power supplies, having access to a password recovery procedure that can only be performed if you're right next to that device and maybe push some buttons on it. Physical security can also impact data confidentiality. I mean, regardless of how much security you might have in place for access control, for validating your users, for enforcing a lot of authentication methods, if somebody can actually remove your hard drives and go home with them, that's probably going to be a big impact onto the confidentiality and integrity of that data. So physical security, I hope you'll find that this is a chapter filled with common sense. And for any questions related to physical security, try to focus on them for a couple of seconds on your own. Just think about them, because anybody can understand physical security. You don't really have to learn it by heart, or you don't even need me to teach you this, actually. And ensuring the security of physical assets is, at the end of the day, an approach that is very similar to what we've been doing so far about securing data. So we're still ensuring confidentiality. We still need to make sure that access to a specific area or a physical area can guarantee a certain level of integrity, so that whatever we store in there can have its integrity guaranteed as well. And also availability is involved as well on two sides, actually. First of all, if anybody has access to your data center, then your availability might be impaired, because anybody can mess around in there. And secondly, the moment you're implementing a physical access system, you are also tasked with maintaining the availability of that system. Because otherwise, if you end up being locked out of your own building, out of your own data center, due to a badly configured physical security policy, you're going to have a bad time, right? That's not what you intended. So in most cases, focusing on physical security is going to be about determining where to invest into dedicated security solutions that can protect actual physical assets or physical areas. And this decision is also included in some sort of a risk assessment, because you don't want to install a retina scan onto every door all over your building, right? You don't want to annoy your users. You don't want to implement so much security that it becomes unusable. And it also might become cost prohibitive. So you're gonna have to identify and design the actual layout, physical layout of the building and of the areas of interest, and where are the people's flowing from, and which are the common areas, which are the areas that hold sensitive data, and try to abstract them in a design that should be as simple as possible, but a design that allows you to implement physical security only at key locations. So let's see a couple of methods by which we can implement physical security controls, starting with something very basic, such as simple warnings and signage that is displayed on a door, on a certain area, explaining to somebody who's about to enter that they will be subjected to video recording perhaps, or that they shouldn't be there if they're not authorized to do so, or that they need a special type of credential in order to access that area. And at the very least, this might discourage a couple of, well, not so determined attackers or intruders. And this is also going to help you from a legal standpoint, because you've just warned potential intruders about the potential consequences that they might face in case they choose to ignore that warning. Secondly, once you've identified the zones that hold sensitive data or sensitive equipment, or areas that are simply not for public access, then you have to install some sort of a entry point security in that area. So make sure that you identify all the entry points, of course, and then make sure you have some sort of an authentication mechanism that is able to check the identity of the person that is about to enter. It could be completely automated. It might be based on a key card, might be based on a fingerprint, might be based on a person put in there in order to check your ID and allow you or deny you access. Now, in general, this type of secure entry point should also be recorded using video and audio so that you'll always know exactly, and you'll have a recorded proof of what happened and who managed to gain access in that secure area. From a design standpoint, never use a secure area as a transit area. In other words, try to minimize the traffic between security zones, as in you have a security zone and you just have to decide who gets to enter it and who gets to leave it. That's it. It's never going to be used as transit between other two areas. Ensuring visibility for certain areas might seem counterintuitive, but it's actually recommended to ensure as much visibility as possible, especially for public areas or for high traffic areas, because a high level of visibility discourages a lot of the people who would normally try to install some rogue devices, maybe perform some surveillance, maybe perform some reconnaissance actions in there. If they know that they're in plain sight and there's no place to hide, they're probably going to look for some other way to get that information. And for direct access between a public area and a secure area, try to install something such as a DMZ, so that there's never going to be a direct access, just one single door or one single barrier between a high traffic area and a highly secure area. Always have some sort of buffer, and in that case, try to avoid any visibility onto the secure area, so that people who are just passing by are not going to be able to just peek inside of your data center. Sometimes this type of buffer can also be considered an air-gapped zone. It's like having a completely empty zone between a high traffic and public area and a high security area. This allows you to observe any traffic that might pass between those two zones and allows you to implement authentication and access control mechanisms between those two areas. And physical security can also help you secure actual data, such as using the traditional safes and vaults to protect highly sensitive pieces of data or highly sensitive assets. For example, the root server of a CA might be stored in such a vault. Of course, it's going to be air gapped, it's going to be completely disconnected from the rest of the network, but we're trying to implement the best level of physical security that we can afford in order to make sure that nobody is going to get their hands onto our private key. And yes, we're not just talking about digital data here. Paper data and printed data can also be stored in such a safe or a vault. Faraday cages can also be used for highly sensitive electronic equipment. A Faraday cage is designed so that no electromagnetic signals can enter or leave that enclosure. This might protect against eavesdropping, might protect against attacks targeted at the electromagnetic emissions of a specific device. And there's actually a specific standard defined by the Department of Defense, the US DoD, called the Tempest standard, in which the devices are certified up to a certain level that they are not emitting or they cannot be intercepted by their electromagnetic emissions. And yet there are solutions for protecting not just the actual equipment, but also the cable runs that reach those equipments, or the cable runs that go through a public area, and because of that they might be exposed to either a denial of service, somebody simply reaching that cable and cutting the cable, and secondly, if somebody has access to the cable, then they could potentially install a tap onto it and then sniff and listen to the data that is passing through it. That's why we also have solutions for protecting data, which are kind of obvious, right? We're simply installing those data into shielded and actually impenetrable metal conduits, so that if somebody attempts to actually reach the cable within that tube, they're either going to create a lot of noise, they're going to create a lot of disturbance, and they're most likely not going to go unnoticed. And finally, back to the basics, don't forget that especially for publicly facing areas, you could channel the traffic flow, and we're talking here about, I don't want to say human trafficking, and we're talking here about the flow of people to specific areas by installing barricades and fences. Also, don't forget about lighting. Well-lit areas are by default already protected against, up to a certain level of course, already protected against potential intruders, because if everything is in plain sight and extremely visible, you're probably going to discourage a lot of potential intruders from trying to do something nasty, such as jump the fence or pick a lock or break some windows, if that area is extremely well lit and they are perfectly visible. Door locks, as simple as they might seem, they're still one of the most efficient methods of securing access to specific areas. Just for the exam, remember that we have three types of door locks. We have physical, mechanical door locks. We also might have electronic door locks, which might be controlled by a keypad or by access through an RFID card. We also have biometric locks, which obviously are going to scan some physical characteristic of whoever tries to pass through, like the fingerprint or the retina. Man traps are the next evolution after locks, and as funny as it might sound, a man trap is exactly what the name says. It's basically a isolated area in which the person that is attempting to go from one area to another is going to be temporarily trapped or subjected to a second authentication mechanism in order to proceed. So you're basically going to have to go through two doors or two barriers, two authentication mechanisms, once to enter the man trap and then to exit the man trap. This allows much better monitoring and much better accounting of whoever went from one security zone to another. And it also avoids a lot of those situations in which one person holds the door for somebody else, or when somebody manages to catch a closing door before it actually gets to close and then succeeds in sneaking in after an authorized person. So we're going to avoid these situations using man traps. Now, of course, they're going to be costly. Sometimes man traps are even augmented using dedicated personnel. That is, while you're in the man trap, there's somebody looking at you, validating your ID in order to allow you to pass through the second door. But this depends on the security level of the company and in general, their security budget, of course. Securing physical access to devices might be performed using cable locks. You might have heard of a Kensington lock. It actually can serve two purposes. The first one, it's kind of obvious, right? You connect the device, like the laptop, with a Kensington lock so that nobody's going to be able to just lift it and leave with it. Secondly, you can also have a Kensington lock that stops any attempt at dismantling the device, like opening the case of a computer. Alarms are designed as a backup system whenever the main security systems happen to be bypassed. So whenever we're detecting the presence of an unauthorized person, whenever we detect movement, or when the person at reception detects that something fishy is about to happen, like a break-in, they could sound an alarm. We actually have multiple types of alarms here. We could have open circuit or closed circuit alarms, which means that the alarm is going to sound either when the circuit is closed or when it is opened. For example, you might have a closed circuit alarm that is going to sound whenever it detects an open window. Now, an open circuit alarm is going to sound whenever it detects a contact being made. As a small note to make here, a open circuit alarm is considered to be less secure because they are designed to be by default monitoring an open circuit. That is, they're going to sound whenever the circuit closes. So if they're designed to be okay with an open circuit, then just by cutting that circuit, maliciously cutting that circuit, you're basically going to bypass that alarm. You can also have motion detection based alarms. That is, the alarm system is connected to some sort of a passive infrared sensor, like those that you hang over the walls or in the corners of the rooms, that detect movement whenever the security system is armed. We can also have alarms that are triggered by noise or by proximity. That is, whenever we need to track the movement of specific tagged objects or assets, like assets with RFID tags. Whenever we sense the fact that the RFID tag is passing through a gateway device, then we're going to sound the alarm. Pretty much what you can find on the RFID tags attached to clothes in pretty much any shop in the mall. And finally, we can implement duress alarms. These are alarms that are manually triggered by the security personnel, by the people sitting at the reception, by whoever happens to detect something fishy, and they decide that an alarm needs to be sound. It might be a silent alarm. It simply notifies the team to intervene, or it might be just a noisy alarm to scare everybody else. Duress can also be implemented as a simple application on a phone, or it can even be a type of authentication code, which has a special value that triggers the duress alarm. So if normally you would have, I don't know, code 1234 in a keypad to access a secure area, if somebody's holding a gun to your head, just by entering 4321, you might also open the secure area, but it'll also trigger a silent alarm. Guards and dogs are also a type of, I like to call it observable physical security, because one of the reasons why we implement people equipped with a uniform and perhaps a gun in order to check your ID and allow you access is not because we couldn't replace those with something like a simple barrier that reads an RFID card, but because the actual presence of a real person that is supposed to check your ID and determine if something looks fishy or you're not being sincere or try to impersonate somebody else is already a deterrent in itself. So in many situations, you might be wondering, why do we see security in a mall or in a pizza restaurant or anywhere where you wouldn't really expect so many bad things to happen that you would need security to intervene? The idea here is that having the security person employed in there and visible at all times, that simple fact is going to discourage most attempts at disturbances. Dogs are very efficient because dogs cannot be bribed and perhaps cannot be even fooled as long as you match whatever they are trained to detect. Cameras, they might be analog, they might be digital, doesn't really matter. In general, the system is called closed circuit television or CCTV. So any type of video surveillance is great. Of course, video surveillance should be augmented by somebody who actually watches the video feed, or at least by a recording feature like a DVR or NVR that is going to store that data for not necessarily very long time, but for a sufficient period of time to allow you to investigate whenever you detect that something fishy has happened. You can also rely on some smart features of recent cameras, such as dynamic identification of faces or car license plates, or at the very least, the ability of a camera to react the moment it detects motion or a specific type of motion, such as the motion generated by a person, not the motion generated by a dog or rustling leaves. And by the way, smart detection is already available in a lot of cameras out there. You don't really have to buy an enterprise-grade solution to benefit from this ability to automatically recognize objects and people by using your IP cameras. So this right here, an example from the back of my house, and please ignore the Christmas lights which are still hanging in there. I can enable vehicle detection, for example, right? You can see it right here. And at the bottom, I can even set a block list or allow list of car license plates that I know I should be seeing in there, perhaps because it might be my car or my neighbor's car passing through, but I could also make that camera alert me whenever a foreign license plate is detected. This is part of the vehicle detection feature. If I go over here under the smart event area, or even basic event, starting with basic event, I can enable motion detection here, right? And I can also detect some smart events, including face detection. Right, or even line crossing detection. So for example, I can draw a theoretical barrier over my graphical representation from the camera, and whenever I detect a person passing behind that virtual barrier, then I'm going to generate an alert. So again, this is not exactly very sci-fi, not exactly very expensive. You can implement this on a lot of hardware out there, even for your own personal use. And of course, reception security, as in employing actual people to check the IDs of whoever's entering your building, your data center, any secure area, is one of the most traditional methods of securing access, and it's also very efficient. Now, of course, you're relying on the integrity of the people that you're employing, but this method can also help you in documenting the IDs of all the people that are entering your building, especially for visitors and people who don't belong to your business, so that whenever a security incident happens and an outsider, for example, might be responsible, you can also backtrack that event down to the actual moment when that person signed in and try to determine their identity, where they came from, and how to make them responsible. Of course, for insiders, for internal users, you should rely on some company-managed set of ID. So usually your employees would have some sort of a badge or RFID or at least some sort of code that they need to present in order to uniquely identify them. HVAC security, that is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, is especially important all over the building, but even more important whenever the protected area is a data center. Because in a data center, you're going to have an extremely high level of control over the temperature and the humidity in there. And always be sure that whatever you're monitoring and whatever changes you're making to the environmental factors are going to be strictly controlled. That is important because, especially in rooms with a lot of equipment, having a too high temperature, of course, might cause the equipment to shut down, to become overheated. Too low temperature, again, might not cause them to even boot up. Too much humidity might cause corrosion and might damage the electrical circuits. And too little humidity might cause static electricity, which is going to damage everything. Also, on a data center, it's important to design the data center in such a way so that you're going to alternate hot and cold aisles. That is, you're simply going to think about the data centers as rows and rows of racks and servers. And between those rows, you're going to have some empty space, right? Air. Now, those are cold aisles, and you should have a cold aisle alternated with a hot aisle. The cold aisle is the aisle from which all the equipment on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, they all draw air from. So that's the air that everybody is using to cool down the equipment, right? So they all have fans, and the fan is going to move the air from one end of the device to the other end of the device. So you're going to have to position those devices in your racks so that all of them are going to draw air, cool air from the cold aisle, and dump or exhaust the hot air onto the hot aisle. Now, of course, the air conditioning in your data center should also be designed in such a way so that it's going to blow cold air into the cold aisle, and it's going to try to take out as much of the hot air from the hot aisle as possible in order to keep a steady temperature in that room. Fire detection and suppression is really important because fire can damage everything, starting from the equipment down to the actual building, not to mention a risk to human lives. So for fire suppression or methods that help you eliminate a fire once it was detected, we have a couple of them that you should remember for the exam. Just to mention a few of them, dry pipe. Dry pipe is used especially when the pipes go through the exterior of the building where there is a risk of freezing. So a dry pipe is not going to hold anything in it. It's not going to hold water unless it is actually required to start a sprinkler system. That is because if you constantly have water in those pipes and they're exposed to sub-zero temperatures, they might freeze and your fire suppression system might not work. Pre-action is kind of like dry pipe, except that whenever the alarm is triggered on a certain level of or threshold of temperature or smoke detection is reached, then those pipes are going to be automatically filled, and only when the actual flame is detected, the sprinklers are going to be activated. Halon was used for some time because it was based on gas and it did not damage electrical systems, but it has been removed by many countries because it attacks the ozone layer. So what we're using nowadays is called clean agent, or sometimes called energen. And it's a type of gas that attempts to deplete the amount of oxygen in that room so that the fire is not going to have any more fuel to maintain itself. Surprisingly enough, physical security is not just about securing access to data, usable data, but also about denying access, so making sure that nobody else is ever going to have access to a specific piece of data that we're planning on deleting or planning on destroying. This is where we find methods for secure erase, secure deletion of data, or even media destruction. So in general, the concept of securely erasing the contents of data from a storage medium is called data sanitization. That is not just simple erasing that data or formatting the disk, but making sure that the actual medium cannot be used in a data recovery process. And nobody's ever going to be able to reconstruct the data that used to be stored on that device. Among these methods, you can probably guess that burning is going to be a very efficient method of destroying pretty much anything. We also have shredding, especially for paper. We have different types of shredders, actually. Some shredders are able to destroy even more than paper, such as CDs or DVDs. Some shredders can even destroy actual hard drives. Well, probably you're not going to buy one of those, but nevertheless, you've probably seen a paper shredder before. Pulping is another method that can be combined with shredding. That is combining the shredded results with water or with some other agent designed at disintegrating the actual pieces of paper that end up after the shredding process. Pulverizing actually means breaking, physically breaking a hardware device. You've seen this in movies, performed with a hammer or with the sole of your shoe. That's probably not the most efficient method, even though many times it's actually going to work. Industrial level pulverizers actually do a lot more damage. And finally, we have degaussing. This applies to magnetic media, that is hard drives. Right, in degaussing, we're hitting the storage medium with a very powerful electromagnetic field, so that it's going to completely damage all the storage cells on that medium, so that they're never going to allow anybody to recover what was stored on them. And even more than that, the hard drive itself is probably not going to be usable again for storing any type of data. So it's kind of a lobotomy that you're doing to the hard drive. And remember that degaussing only applies to magnetic media. So SSDs and flash drives, they aren't going to give a damn about degaussing. Now, talking about sanitization tools that don't involve hammers and fire and chemicals, we do have the option of performing a secure erase on storage medium. For both hard drives and SSDs, one method would be to simply write zeros on top of the entire disk, including the free space, of course. But in most cases, this is not going to be enough. Now, there are specific industrial recovery methods that even after a zero erase, data still can be recovered. Alternate methods include writing random patterns of data, random patterns of bytes, or even performing multiple passes, like 3 passes, 7 passes, 11 passes over the same disk in order to make sure that all the previous remnants are completely gone. In general, especially for SSD drives, this is not always very possible because an SSD has kind of a mind of its own due to the fact that most SSDs try to monitor the usage of their storage cells so that they are going to try to distribute data as much as possible onto the available cells and try to always write data into the least used cell up to that point in order to preserve the endurance of the entire drive. You cannot really rely on having an SSD the ability to write a piece of data exactly where you want it to write it. So that's why most secure erase methods actually need to be developed by the actual manufacturer of the SSD itself. And most vendors out there do allow you to download some dedicated tools from their websites which allow you to perform this type of secure erase. Because otherwise, if you're relying on the SSD's controller, you're not going to be able to overwrite all the areas of that SSD just by using normal operating system calls. Now, the software provided by the vendor knows how to interact with the firmware of the device, especially for this type of secure erase intervention. For self-encrypting drives, the method employed is very similar to what we talked about when we mentioned a remote wipe that can be performed on the mobile devices. That is, once you have the entire device encrypted with an encryption key, you really don't need to waste time rewriting each and every piece of data, every sector and block on that disk with random data or zeros. You need only to remove the encryption key. So the only secure erase process that you need to perform is a secure erase process onto a very small piece of data, which is the actual data encryption key. Throw away the key and the remaining data, encrypted data, becomes unusable. Congratulations, you've reached the end of this training. I really hope you found it interesting, useful, fun, enjoyable, or any other positive adjective that you can think about, because I've tried to make it as well as possible in order to provide you with free training, in order to provide you with something really useful, and in order to help you become a better professional and perhaps even a better person. So with that being said, just leave me a comment, let me know what you thought about this training, hit me with any positive or negative feedback, I can take them both. Good luck on the exam, don't forget to get some hands-on practice with a couple of the tools mentioned in this training, and if you think I deserve one, buy me a coffee, why not? So thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you will enjoy your future career in IT security. Goodbye and see you next time.